Good morning, everyone. This is Data Download, Saturday, the 18th of July. And hopefully you get the newsletter and you read the newsletter, in which case you don't need to see me reading it to you, but happy to read it to you and chat about what we're going to cover today. If you're not a subscriber already and you want to subscribe, look on the screen. It's nycmedialab.org/newsletters. Very memorable. I want to start with a bit of a story. So it was January of 2012. How many of you remember January of 2012? Probably not that many of you. I'm not sure I do. But the NYC Economic Development Corporation released a report back then titled Media 2020, way into the future, far away. It was commissioned by the Bloomberg Administration. It made some bold predictions about how media would evolve in New York. And also, interestingly enough, didn't see some twists and turns that we're now living through. But, that's the nature of crystal ball gazing, futurism. But one of the things it did back then was called for the formation of the NYC Media Lab. So kudos to them. And it was done. And 8 years ago, a young man who was at The Economist was tapped to be the executive director and joined the nascent Media Lab. His name was Justin Hendricks, and I'm sure all of you know who he is if you're reading this newsletter or watching this stream. It's hard to describe Justin if you don't work with him. He's a force of nature, but he's also Southern, and so very easygoing and patient and pleasant, but quite driven, and in a different kind of way that conventional New Yorkers are, like not sharp-elbowed, but I don't know if he'd like this word, but I would almost say genteel in some interesting ways. Anyway, the point of this is that Justin, who has been the executive director of this organization for the last 8 years, has decided it's time to move on. And as, again, many of you probably know, 3 years ago, he began running the building and spinning up the R Lab, AR/VR, down at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so he's been doing double duty as executive director of the Media Lab and also executive director of R Lab. And so in the newsletter, you'll find some conversation about him. There's a video that I think is, maybe I'll show you a clip of in a minute. But that's kind of the big change as we approach the fall, August, and then the fall here at Media Lab. So let's just jump through the newsletter, and we'll go through it fairly quickly because some of these articles really are better read than narrated. There's a terrific piece in the New York Times about how artists are working to solve the world's problems, and I'll just read you for a moment. A cohort of 30 artists have received funding to find creative solutions to 21st century problems like surveillance, digital inequality, and intellectual trauma. The article is by Zachariah Small. It's a terrific read. It's in the newsletter. You can get it obviously in the New York Times, but the newsletter is the easiest way. And maybe just for a second, a little bit of a talk about how we curate the newsletter each week. We work really hard to be both forward-thinking and thoughtful and share some things with you that maybe haven't been organized for you, but also surprising and a little different. And in that, the word, those of you who know me a long time will laugh, but I mean, really the newsletter is carefully curated, thoughtfully curated. And so this article, I think, is a good example of that. Next, a change in visual design. Apple, one could argue, has been driving visual design on the web, going back to the early days of the laser printer and then the look and feel of iOS. But Mac OS 11, known as Big Sur, has made some interface changes that are really quite dramatic. And we found an article from Applied Pixels that talks about that. But really the images tell the whole story. I won't read it to you, but it is, we all spend our days on these devices and maybe don't give a lot of thought to how their look and feel and quote unquote playfulness impacts us. So I would encourage you to take a look at the appliedpixels.com blog, or obviously look at it in the newsletter as well. Next up in the newsletter, an unusual and I think very interesting article from lionbridge.ai about neural synthesia when art meets scans. So again, I'll just read you just a little bit of it because I think it'll be helpful to hear some of the words. Neural synthesia is an AI art project that aims to create new and unique audiovisual experiences within artificial intelligence. It does this through a collaboration between humans and generative networks, and the results feel almost like organic art. Swirls of color and images blend together as faces, scenery, objects, and the architecture transforms to music. Again, as we get into the middle of the summer, wanted to just be able to share something both visually different and also intellectually stimulating that takes you out of maybe some of the unbelievably exhausting news of the day. So with that, next up, a piece from Vice about a guy who is crossing the country using Google Street View one click at a time. A Harvard sophomore is driving across the country on Google Street View because this is a world we now live in. I don't know about you guys. Whenever I use Street View, maybe it's just me, but I find getting the arrow to point in the right direction and go down the street I want to go down is incredibly challenging, and I often get lost and make wrong turns and end up not where I want to be. So the idea of sitting in front of a computer and clicking your way across America in Street View strikes me as, just to be blunt, absolutely exhausting. Like I think I'd rather be in a car or on a motorcycle or a horse or a bicycle or a skateboard than on Street View. That being said, it is a journey, and it is a visceral, digital, non-pandemic, dangerous journey. So are any of you thinking about taking a journey on Street View? If so, would love to hear about that. And by the way, we're able to see comments from a couple of different places. So appreciate that Samit says, yeah, same here. Yeah, Street View is exhausting. Good. I'm glad it's not just me. All right. Next article is from Digiday. Publishers are wary of the latest attempt to standardize GDPR compliance. I find GDPR fascinating, maybe for one simple reason, which is it's the first time in my memory that a non-US change in digital behavior is coming to the US kind of preordained, but not of our making. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think that publishers increasingly are like, we have to build a global platform, and that means we need to accept GDPR. Whether we can't have two versions of the internet, one with GDPR and one without. But this latest attempt to standardize GDPR compliance is frothy and interesting, and would be a good thing for you to read and comment on. I would like your comments. All right, so that brings me to the story that I told you at the beginning of the podcast today. I was going to play a little bit of this video, but to be honest, StreamYard gets a little funny about what things it allows me to play sound on. Let me just try. I'll just play for a second. We'll see if we can hear.
NYC Media Lab explores emerging media technology to look at how technology is changing the way we interact with information, entertainment, and with media. So when I think of 5G, I think of low latency, the capability to move a lot of computing to the edge. So if you imagine in medicine and advanced imaging, virtual and augmented reality applications, and the opportunity to share vast amounts of information very quickly, it's just a huge amount of opportunity.
The Media Lab is a consortium of universities here in New York City. What we try to do is to connect various disciplines across the city's campuses, from computer science and engineering, design, journalism, the arts, and a variety of other disciplines, in order to drive emerging media technology innovation.
So the reason I started talking about the 2020 report, I think it's very easy to look at things that are around us and presume that they would have been there. But if you look at the last 8 years in New York and you look at the extraordinary growth in startups and incubators and companies and digital, it's all connected together, right? So I remember when I was working with New York City around that same time, 8 years ago, getting young students, even CS students that had had great academic experiences in New York, to stay in New York and be willing to build companies here was really hard. They would go to school here, they'd have great CS experiences, and then they would go to San Francisco. And I don't know if you remember, but there was this whole, oh, will New York ever be San Francisco? So now here we are with a great big technology footprint in New York, and companies and resources and startups and accelerators and money. And that was not a fait accompli. That was going to have to be made by individuals. And I would argue that on the short list of individuals who are responsible for the last 8 years of making that happen, Justin Hendricks would be, I don't want to say whether he's in the top 3 or the top 5, but certainly one of a handful of individuals that every day worked hard to make that happen. And my guess is lots of the people who are listening to this or watching this, have had their decision to be part of the New York tech infrastructure impacted by his programs and his outreach and his commitment to New York. So as we move into this next chapter of tech in New York, and there are some absolute challenges ahead for sure, I think it's worth thinking about what we can all do to pay that forward and to make sure that New York remains the critically central, spiritually, ideologically relevant and important part of the technology infrastructure. So with that, so that's what we're watching this week. We're also obviously watching our amazing Bloomberg series. We're on episode 3 this week. Let's pull that down, which is just a fantastic conversation led by Erica Matsumoto, my colleague, with Ian Allen, Kathy O'Neill, and Riley Jones about tech ethics, diversity, bias, inequality, and privacy. It's frothy as hell. It's really interesting. The panel's amazing. Don't miss it. And then we're also listening to a podcast this week. We're listening Into the Void, which has a chilling and brilliant July 12th podcast titled "They're Always Watching," just because we thought something light would be nice. All right, and then last but not least, for a long read from pragmaticengineer.com. I assume you're all regular readers of pragmaticengineer.com. It's probably on your coffee table, or not. Data structures and algorithms actually used working at tech companies. I actually use working at tech companies, which is also fascinating. So with that, that's the newsletter for this week. Please, please, please subscribe, share with your friends. Also, we love feedback. So respond to this, NYCMediaLab.org has all kinds of ways for you to communicate with us. Hope you're having a good summer and staying safe and wearing a mask. And with that, we will be back again next week to read you another edition of the newsletter.